Everyone for the opportunity to speak to you today. So yeah, I lead up the long-term monitoring program at AIMS, and I thought I'd give you a bit of an insight into this thorny question from our perspective. First, just a bit of a shout out. You know, the team spends a lot of time together out on the water, and they're a really great team. So I just wanted to acknowledge all the roles that everyone plays there, and also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and sea country in which we work. So AIMS undertakes a raft of monitoring activities. We've got the long-term monitoring program, its sister program, which looks at the effects of the rezoning of the reef from 2004. There's dedicated monitoring of inshore reefs under the Reef Water Quality Protection Plan, and also water quality monitoring itself. But I'm just going to focus on the top program here. So we have basically two components to the LTMP. We do dedicated surveys at fixed sites. So we've got, we divide the coast into 11 latitudinal bands, and within each of those bands we survey replicate reefs in 3 shelf positions: the inshore, mid-shelf and offshore. And then at each individual reef we have 3 sites of 5 permanently marked transects. And so along these transects then we quantify the benthic community using digital imagery, and also quantify fish communities using underwater visual census. We also look at agents of coral mortality, so obviously crown of thorns is one of them, but also bleaching, disease and storm damage. The other component we use is manitoes, broad-scale manito technique, which is not advancing. There we go. Okay, and as it's been pointed out, it is like a human lure. So we've been doing this since 1985. We've surveyed about 400 and something reefs in that time, spread from the top of Cape York all the way down to the Capricorn Bunkers. And the way we work is we use 2 boats. You start at a common point on the reef, you go in opposite directions in a series of 2-minute tows, and the observer records categorical data on hard and soft coral cover, numbers and size of crown of thorns, starfish, any scarring that we see, plus the counts of trout and sharks. And that's just a bit of a visual picture of Lady Musgrave. You can see each of those squiggly lines there is a 2-minute tow, and it's colour-coded by the percent hard coral cover. You can also see this was obviously pre-cull, but each of those little stars there is where we've encountered Cots. So what do we do with all this data? There's a lot of it. A few years ago, 2008, Hugh Sweetman, who used to lead up the LTMP, brought out a paper that looked at the Cots problem. And what he found, which I think we all know, is that you can see this southward progression of the outbreak. So this is the one that started in the early 90s, up in the initiation box. It slowly moved south to basically the bottom of the Whitsundays by the early 2000s. Interestingly, also found that the vast majority of outbreaks are occurring on mid-shelf reefs. And the really interesting thing for the first time, I think, was that there is an effect of zoning with Cots outbreaks. So this figure down here, you can see the black bars are the number of reefs with outbreaks, the white bars are without, and in open zones you can see there's a lot more reefs that have active outbreaks compared to those in no-take marine reserves. This is a similar figure just looking at the mid-shelf reefs. We have revisited this data recently, but I promised Frederica wouldn't steal her thunder, and she's going to update you on that a little later on in the day. Obviously, collecting information on reef fishes also allows us to look at the direct and indirect effects of reef fishes' predation on crown of thorns starfish. But again, unfortunately, I can't steal Fred's thunder. And you'll just have to wait and see what she's got to say about that. But I just thought I'd mention that here, bit of a shout out to our data set. So we do keep quite a good database on the disturbances that we see out on the reef, and this plot here shows you the disturbance regime from the mid-1980s in the northern, the central and the southern GBR. And I think the first take-home message of this is that there's never been a year on the reef without a disturbance somewhere. Okay, so it's an inherent part of the system. We all know that, but I guess the concerning trend here is the increase in the number of reefs that are now being impacted by these severe disturbances. So in the last, the last 5 years, you can really see that the number of reefs impacted has really ramped up, particularly in the 16-17 bleaching, but also due to cyclones as well. And you can actually put some modelling on this. So this is the probability of an individual survey reef being impacted by bleaching in red, crown of thorns in green, and cyclones in blue. And I guess what this is revealing is that there is now an increase in the frequency of, these are just the severe categories of those disturbances. There's an increase in the probability of the climate-driven disturbances like bleaching and cyclones. So they're statistically significant increases. Crown of thorns, however, have just been kind of trucking along here. There's not much change in the probability of a reef being hit by it. And I think that's quite important because, as we all have heard, this is the one thing we can actually do something about. So the climate change disturbances are being, they're ramping up, and it's not just a future prediction anymore, it's actually happening now. But we can do something about Cots, and I think we've got to give that our best go. In terms of how much damage do, they do a lot, as I'm sure we're all aware. So this is an analysis I did for a FRDC project recently, and what you can see is that Cots are pretty much the main driver of coral decline on the GBR at the moment. The only one that's higher here is the multiple disturbances, and that's usually got Cots associated with it anyway. So we know they're bad, and that really sets it into context for you. I mean, they're even worse than the damage you get from cyclones and storms. So they really can knock the reefs down pretty quickly. And then having a really long temporal series allows you to look at the temporal dynamics of the Cots outbreaks, and we can see the shifts through time. So there's the first or the second outbreak that occurred on the GBR. We kind of caught it at the start of our sampling around the Townsville region, and it slowly moved its way south. The second outbreak started in the 90s, moved its way south again, and we can see now the third outbreak is has progressed down to the Townsville region. So interestingly, we just see in the Princess Charlotte Bay area, just this really kind of slow burn. Cots are kind of there in low numbers all the time. And I had an interesting discussion with Morgan the other day, and he was suggesting, that maybe it is this slow burn that's actually feeding into the initiation box, and that's something I think we need to possibly look at and get some dedicated monitoring up in those areas. And I guess just the other thing to highlight is the Swain seems to, be doing its own thing as well down in the southern end there. So I wanted to I was talking to Dave here, and he wanted to try and get an idea of how effective culling actually is. And I think you can look at this two ways. You can say, is it effective in removing starfish? And I think that's a no-brainer. But the more vexing question is it effective at preserving hard coral cover? So I think we're all aware that the culling's doing a really good job, but it's nice to just visualise it. So this is the average number of Cots per year across the whole GBR. And you can see that this latest outbreak is significantly lower than the previous two densities of Cots. So it's obviously an effect of the culling that started, and from that I think we can see it's doing a pretty good job. Another way of looking at it is possibly with the amount of culling effort that's going on. My take on it, and I'm not fully across the culling data, but it seems to me that the Cairns and Townsville areas have some really, really intensive culling going on. Cooktown, Lizard and Innisfail perhaps not as much. And you can see that the peaks of starfish numbers are a lot less where the really intensive culling's been happening compared to these other two regions. So I think we can categorically say that, yeah, culling's doing a good job of knocking down those numbers, and I think that's important in terms of the progression of the wave, and I'll get to that in just a minute. Dave also asked me, do you think we are actually preserving hard coral cover out there on the reef? So I went away and just had a little first pass at the data. This is all of our reefs that we surveyed where culling has occurred. And just looking at a simple kind of before-after look at the data, it's not such a great look, all right? There's a lot of decline in hard coral cover across most of those reefs. But I guess the tricky part of this comes when it's not just Cots alone. We all know that. So most of the reefs where declines have happened is also where we've had significant bleaching in the 16 and 17 events particularly. And so actually trying to tease apart how effective culling is at preserving hard coral cover is a really difficult question. You've got to try and tease out the effects of different disturbance types, and that takes some fairly serious modelling, which I'm going to embark on fairly shortly. But it is a really nuanced question as well. So looking at John Brewer Reef, which we heard yesterday from the culling guys, is a really, really troublesome reef. 55 trips, they're still pulling Cots off it. When you look at the reef-wide data, it's a pretty grim outlook as well. We've seen significant declines here in coral cover in recent years. So I had a bit of a look at the CPUE data that Gobrumpa supplied me, and this is what I think has kind of happened. So early on, so 2014 to early 2017, CPUE is really low. There's not many Cots around, not much effort going into it. Things really picked up in around 2017. A lot of effort started going into it, but that culling effort probably started just a little bit too late. Okay, so we can already see decline starting in coral cover by the time culling has started, which is this red line here. But there is actually some good news to this. We look at the reefs as in 4 separate little habitats, and really good news story here happened up here on the northeast flank. So we can see that coral cover started declining. That's probably some bleaching and some Cots. Cots team got in there, and it looks like they've completely stopped the decline, and we've started to see some recovery. So that's some really good news, and I think it shows that culling is an effective tool at preserving coral cover at some scales. Okay, it's not such a good news on the front here where we've just seen massive decline, but also on the second flank down here, I think we've seen an arresting of that decline as well. This is Rib Reef, not far from John Brewer. It's had phenomenal numbers of Cots on it, and the only thing I really wanted to say about this is just highlight the timing of when culling started, which is again this red line. And you can see that Cots numbers are up around 6 per toe, which is phenomenal numbers, and it's driven down coral cover to very low levels across the whole of that reef. So I think the timing of the starting of culling is really important when we're talking about preserving hard coral cover, and if you can get in there early enough, I think you can not only remove a lot of starfish, but you can actually save some coral. And the final thing I want to leave you with is how effective is it at stopping the spread? So as we've heard, there's been a hell of a lot of culling happening in this box just off Townsville. They've pulled off phenomenal numbers of starfish. And when you think about the previous outbreaks, a couple of years after it's peaked in Townsville, we've seen the progression down to the Cape Upstart sector. We hadn't been there for a few years, so I was really curious to see what's going on down there. We've just come back from surveying 11 reefs down there, and I'm happy to report there's very little activity. We've got no active outbreaks and very low numbers of Cots on a couple of reefs and some scars. So it's probably too early to say that the culling efforts actually stopped this progression, but I think, as I said, in previous outbreaks, we've already seen high numbers of starfish on those reefs. So I'll just leave you with that as a thought that, I think the culling effort's doing a good job. So I'll just sum that up now. So our long-term spatially extensive monitoring data set, can really set the scene and look at the extent and the impacts of Cots, put it into context. We can see from the data they are important drivers of GBR coral mortality. We now know that the climate-driven disturbances such as bleaching and cyclones are increasing in frequency, are increasing in spatial extent. Okay, they're not a prediction anymore, they're actually happening on the GBR. However, Cots have been trucking along consistently through time, all right, they've been there, but they are the one thing that can be locally managed, and they are being locally managed, and we need to continue to do that. The first pass at looking at the effectiveness from our data, as I mentioned, is confounded by that problem of multiple disturbances, and it's going to take some pretty fancy modelling to get at that. But there's definitely evidence of reduced Cots densities where we've had extensive cullings, and I think that the timing of that culling is really important. So if we can get some really good on-the-ground knowledge of when things are starting to ramp up, I think we can get in there and make a big difference. And I think there's also strong evidence that, it does play a really important role in preserving hard coral cover. And I would call for some proactive culling in that far northern section, or at least monitoring to keep an eye, as David pointed out before. So I'll leave you with that. Thanks for listening.